Charles KRAUTHAMMER. Donald Trump is not at 50%. Poor Mitt Romney. Donald Trump shouldn't run. Conservative eggheads. Donald Trump. A couple of papers. Donald Trump. Glenn Beck. Donald Trump. Ted Cruz. Donald Trump. Lindsey Graham. Donald Trump's strategy doesn't work. The Washington Post. Donald Trump wants to let Japan go nuclear. Donald Trump doesn't like NATO. Donald Trump will never run. Well, I don't know if Trump is going to win. He won't do well. He doesn't know foreign policy. He shouldn't be allowed on the debate stage. Donald Trump isn't Christian. Tim Kaine. Donald is this, he's that. This lightweight Rubio. Trump's a conman. Trump's a conman. Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Donald Trump will not become the president.
On the show tonight, a Clinton speech on economic inclusion and our new poll of high-income voters. But first, we're going to start the program with yet another police shooting that has captured the nation's attention. Protests erupted yesterday in Charlotte, North Carolina, after police shot and killed 43-year-old Keith Lamont Scott. Police say Scott emerged from his vehicle with a gun before he was killed. Scott's family has disputed the police accounts, claiming he was unarmed. After all that, demonstrations turned violent last night as protesters vandalized businesses, threw rocks at police, and at one point, they blocked a highway by looting a truck and setting fire to a pile of boxes. All of this happened, of course, a day after police in Tulsa, Oklahoma released that video showing an officer shooting an unarmed African-American man, Terrence Crutcher, who appeared to have his hands in the air when he was shot. While campaigning today at a church in Ohio, Donald Trump was asked about that Tulsa footage.
To me, it looked like he did everything you're supposed to do. And he looked like a really good man. And maybe I'm a little clouded because I saw his family talking about him after the fact. So you get a little bit, different image maybe. But to me, he looked like somebody that was doing what they were asking him to do. And this young officer, I don't know what she was thinking. I don't know what she was thinking. But I'm very, very troubled by that. I'm very, very troubled by that. And we have to be very careful. So, I mean, these things are terrible. That was, in my opinion, that was a terrible situation. And we've seen others. And the police are aware of that, too. By the way, the police are troubled by it, too. They look at it. Now, did she get scared? Was she choking? What happened? But maybe people like that, people that choke, people that do that, maybe they can't be doing what they're doing.
Hillary Clinton also commented on the latest shootings. She took a moment during her speech today here in Orlando to address the matter as well.
There is still much we don't know about what happened in both incidents, but we do know that we have 2 more names to add to a list of African Americans killed by police officers in these encounters. It's unbearable, and it needs to become intolerable. I've spoken to many police chiefs and other law enforcement leaders who are as deeply concerned as I am and deeply committed as I am to reform. Why? Because they know it is essential for the safety of our communities and our officers.
So, John, how do these latest pair of police shootings of African-American men seem to be impacting the presidential race, and how are the 2 candidates handling the situation?
Well, Mark, we talked about this yesterday. Obviously, before the situation in Charlotte had unfolded, we only knew about the Tulsa shooting at that time. This is the second time now where in the last couple months where there have been more than one such police shooting, and they've broken through in a significant way. Obviously, this is a huge problem in cities across the country, and it's a real challenge for both candidates. I thought that both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton handled this pretty well today. Trump taking a kind of different line than he's taken it sometimes in the past, that's a little different from what his campaign manager and even his vice presidential running mate took a few hours earlier, expressing more sympathy for the victim in the case in Tulsa. And of course, Hillary Clinton, who talks about this with great fluency. I think they're both handling it pretty well. I don't know what the political impact is, but it's clearly something that is going to continue to be a topic of discussion so long as these events keep happening as we head towards Election Day.
Yeah, there's no question that Trump's remarks today were more striking than Clinton's, not because he spoke with more compassion than she did by any means, but because they were a lot different than the way, as you said, not just Kellyanne Conway and Mike Pence talked, but the way Donald Trump has largely talked about these matters. I think it's great in the face of tragedy for both of them to take time to talk about it, to reflect on it, and to give us a sense of the kind of leaders they'd be if they were president starting in January, of how they will deal with this. Because it's pretty clear, although there is something of a national debate about remedies, this is still a problem that's going to bedevil the country at least for some time.
Right. I mean, I think one of the questions is whether you think this is, as Hillary Clinton does, and as there's a lot of evidence to suggest, a systematic or a systemic problem, and one that's related to race and racial bias. It's not a mystery that a lot of the victims in these cases have been African American men. In some cases, justified police shootings. In many cases, way too many cases, either unjustified or apparently unjustified. Certainly, the Tulsa case qualifies there. So Hillary Clinton talks about this, I think, in a more kind of comprehensive way than Trump does. But again, as you point out, Trump taking a very different tone today. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. With fewer than 50 news cycles left before the big E-Day, Hillary Clinton seems to be making at least a slight shift in her messaging plan. Instead of mainly, or really only, trying to disqualify Donald Trump, she is adding a positive track, talking more about herself, what she's done, and what she'd do as president. That was exactly what we saw today with her speech in Orlando, Florida, the focus of which was on helping people with disabilities be a bigger part of the workforce, as an example of her broader goal of building what she calls an inclusive economy.
First, we're going to focus on jobs and incomes. I'm going to fight to give more Americans with disabilities the chance to work alongside those without disabilities and do the same jobs for the same pay and benefits. Second, we're going to work with our colleges and universities to make them more accessible to students with disabilities. Third, we're going to partner with businesses and other stakeholders to ensure those living with a disability can get hired and stay hired. As part of that, we'll launch a new effort we're calling Autism Works, to help people with autism succeed in the workplace. Fourth, let's build on the success of the Americans with Disabilities Act by finally ratifying the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Long before that speech, or a little before that speech at least, Clinton started off her day with an op-ed in the New York Times highlighting aspects of her economic resume and framing the presidential race as a choice, quote, between an economy that works for everyone and an economy that benefits the well-off at the expense of everyone else. We have talked a lot on this show about how Clinton has struggled to articulate her own theory of the case about where the American economy stands and what has to happen with it. We are not the only ones who've noticed that. A brand new NBC News Wall Street Journal national poll has Clinton with a 7-point lead among likely voters in a two-way matchup, 48 to 41%. That margin shrinks to 6 points in a four-way race. She's ahead in both, though. But when asked who would be better at handling the economy, more registered voters said Trump over Clinton, 46 to 41%. So, Mark, you were down there in Orlando at Hillary Clinton's speech. How do you think she did?
She did just fine in terms of speaking from her heart, talking a little bit about the story of her mother's life, which she's gone to many times to try to explain to people her perception of the country. She talked a lot about people with disabilities who she's known and some prominent examples. It was a very moving speech in some ways, but it does highlight the fact that she continues to not, I think, reach for a way to kind of bring all the strands together and talk about how she'd be a great jobs president. It's a real vulnerability for her. And while she spoke from the heart today, and it was a perfectly serviceable speech, and she talked about issues that are really important to her, I still think she's vulnerable to this because Trump talks a brash game. And on jobs right now, I think a lot of voters are looking for brash.
Well, I think there's still work for her to do, and there's no question if she's going to make an inclusive economy the theme, the broad theme under which she wants to kind of flesh out her theory of the case and her economic argument, she has a lot more work to do because it's a potentially powerful theme. She has not yet kind of laid it all out with the kind of clarity that she might, but it is a potentially powerful theme. And the problem for Donald Trump, I agree, he talks tough on jobs, but as you know, many economists, both Republican and Democrat, think that Trump is by far the weaker candidate when it comes to economics. Voters do not. So the question is whether Hillary can build her own argument and also lay bare the weaknesses in his economic arguments that a lot of professional economists see.
Yeah. Look, I've been watching her since the early 90s, and this is her last event before Monday's debate, at least as of now, last public event. I think just reading her body language and her presentation today, I think her head's in a very good place for the debate. I think she feels she's got a pretty good balance between talking about herself and her own vision for the country, but also trying to take down Donald Trump. So if I were folks, I'd be encouraged, at least for what today suggests about the debate. The August fundraising numbers are out, and the headlines are many. It was the best month yet for both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Clinton raised $58 million in August. Trump raised $41 million. Pretty remarkable given that it was summertime when people aren't necessarily attending fundraisers or writing checks. There was a pretty wide spending disparity between the two campaigns last month. Clinton outspent Trump nearly 2-to-1. Clinton also now has, according to the reports, twice as much cash on hand, although Team Trump is doing a victory lap because they raised $12 million in small donations, under $200. That's $4 million more than Clinton raised from those people. By comparison, though, Barack Obama raised $25 million from small donors in 2012. Mitt Romney, $9.4 million from those donors. Bad news, though, for Trump. Sheldon Adelson, the Vegas billionaire who Trump has spent a lot of time courting, has given money, but most of it not to Trump. Adelson and his cash are being directed almost entirely towards helping other Republican candidates. A little bit went to a group supporting Trump. So, John, on all these bullet points, which one do you think is going to have the most implications for Election Day?
Well, there are two linked ones, right? I mean, the one to me that matters the most almost always is cash on hand, and the fact that the Clinton campaign has not just more cash on hand, but substantially more cash on hand puts them in a better place heading into this home stretch than Donald Trump is in. Obviously, the Sheldon Adelson news is going to make the most headlines just because Sheldon Adelson is a big, flashy, gaudy name. And as you said, the Trump campaign spent a lot of time courting him. The fact that that money is not going to be supplementing Trump's relatively meager, relatively compared to the Clinton campaign, relatively meager cash holdings is a problem for him going forward.
Yeah, look, when we get down to it, if this is a close race, the polls suggest now it will be. Look at the battleground states. I think it's going to, the question is going to be, can the combined forces of the Trump campaign, which has less than the Clinton campaign, and the RNC produce a competitive ground game based on what they believe is greater enthusiasm, innovation, efficiency? Those are claims they continue to make. I spent time with the Trump field operation here in Florida today. They say they're confident that they will be super competitive in this state. You hear that in the other battleground states. It's an open question, and the proof will be on Election Day when we see just how they do, not just, I should say, on Election Day, but also with early voting and absentee ballots, et cetera. Are they technically efficient enough, well-funded enough to be competitive on those fronts with the Trump folks, with the Clinton folks?
Huge question, and we will know in fewer than 50 days. When we come back, campaign managers and the art of dodging questions after these words from our sponsors. Like a lot of news programs, we here at With All Due Respect have extended an open invitation to the presidential candidates who want to come on this program. Hillary, Donald, there is always a comfy chair waiting for you on our set. More often, though, we in the media get to ask our pent-up political questions to the candidates' campaign managers and other strategists and surrogates. But here's the problem. When it comes to policy questions, we don't always get a clear answer. Take Clinton campaign chief Robbie Mook today on Morning Joe, who was asked about his boss's policy on Syria.
Was it a mistake to draw the red line if the president was not willing to go to do something about it when it was crossed?
Well, as you pointed out, the decision regarding that was made after she was out of office, so I think you'd have to ask
Was she disappointed that the president didn't act when the line was crossed?
I think you'd have to ask her about that question, how she would characterize
well, you're here
her
to speak
feelings
for her, Robbie, so you haven't discussed that at all?
You can go on our website and read the full plan there. Again, I think you're going to have to ask her that question. That's a matter of policy. I'm going to leave it her to determine that. I'm going to let her statements speak for themselves.
Robbie, aren't you here representing her point of view?
I am indeed, and I'm going to let her language speak for itself.
Okay, so that was not great, but it's not just Robbie Mook who has some problems sometimes answering straightforward questions. Listen to Trump campaign manager Kellyanne Conway on Sunday when she was asked about her boss, Donald Trump, being a birther.
How and when did Donald Trump conclude that the president was born in the United States?
You'll have to ask him that.
Donald Trump advocated something for 5 years that was a lie. Why did he do that?
Well, you're going to have to ask him.
Okay, so today, after that Morning Joe interview with Robbie Mook, Clinton's campaign manager got a little assist from the guy who held that post for President Obama. That would be David Plouffe, who tweeted, quote, "Presidential campaign manager's job is to execute a winning strategy to secure 270 electoral votes, not to make new policy. Know the difference." So, Mark, my question for you, my friend, is whether David Plouffe is right or wrong.
He's 1/4 right. It's true, these are political operatives. They're not policy people. But they constantly come on our programs and say, why are you asking about policy? Why are you only obsessed with politics? If their position is they can only answer political questions, then they should expect political questions. But they should also, in order to help the country, they should put out experts on topics that people are interested in. And that includes not just policy, but if there's matters of controversy. I find it ridiculous that someone with the title campaign manager will take the position, ask Mr. Trump. Unless she's going to produce Mr. Trump or he's going to produce Secretary Clinton, I think it's a bit of a charade. I get it, but they're going to have to accept the fact that if they're political people, then they should expect political questions and not criticize us for asking policy questions.
I think they should answer policy questions. I think they should answer policy questions and political questions. They're the senior person or one of the couple of senior people on the campaign. They spend a lot of time with their candidates ostensibly. In a lot of cases, like the questions asked Kellyanne Conway and Robbie Mook in this case, they're asking, what does the candidate think about X? David Plouffe mischaracterizes it and says, well, it's not their job to make new policy. That's not a question of new policy. Hillary Clinton wrote about what she thought about the red line in Syria in her book. Has Robbie Mook read the book? He should read the book and be able to say what Hillary Clinton's point of view was on that. And in Kellyanne Conway's case, she spent all last week talking about the birther stuff with Donald Trump, or assume she did. She must have some idea about what his thinking was, and we have a right to expect her to know.
And let's be realistic. They often, almost always, say that's their answer when they don't want to answer a tough question,
yes,
not
correct.
because they actually don't know. Right.
Correct, exactly right. That's just their chosen form of obfuscation. All right, up next,
exactly.
And they should stop doing that. Up next, we will talk more about what Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump said on the campaign trail today with two esteemed, amazing, incredible political journalists. We'll be right back with them.
best political reporters in America join us now, both from Washington, D.C. Margaret Talev, our colleague, Bloomberg's chief White House correspondent in our D.C. bureau, and Dan Balls, the Washington Post chief correspondent, is in the paper's newsroom. Thank you both for being here. Dan, start with you. Ask you both the same question. How do you think, based on the performance of the candidates over this week and heading into the debate Monday, how do you think they both look in terms of fighting form to be ready for that showdown?
Oh, I think they both need a little work and a lot of practice over the next 4 or 5 days, and they're going to do it in their own way. I mean, Hillary Clinton is going to be down much of that time between now and the debate, going through rigorous debate practice and probably a whole series of mock debates. Donald Trump will do it his own way, which will be, I won't call it a relaxed approach, but it will be a different approach. He's not going to cram himself full of facts and figures, but he will have a sense of the strategy that he wants to take into the debate. So, but I think both of them have to be a little bit nervous because this is a more unpredictable environment. The topics are very broad that Lester Holt has laid out, and we don't quite know what Donald Trump will be like. So I think that there's, there has to be nervousness on both sides.
Margaret, how do you think they're headed trajectory-wise towards Monday?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing with Clinton this week, at least, is that she's certainly trying to project a really sort of calm, prepared, paced approach, sticking to the facts. Her whole appearance at, up at the UN, trying to show off kind of her statesman-like credentials. She wants to try to remain calm and unflappable. I think just as much to convince herself that she can do that on Monday as anything else. And if she can keep that up and go in there kind of in a I'm not going to take the bait kind of mode, that's ideally what she wants. I mean, I think what the campaign is afraid of, and the reason why everybody in the world is going to tune in, is to see whether she can pull that off.
So, Margaret, I want to stay with you. Just in terms of what you know about how they're dealing with debate prep, let's just stay with this topic as it is like the biggest topic out there in some ways. How do you think she's actually, just technically speaking, going about the process of trying to get ready for the unpredictability of Donald Trump?
In many ways, I'm going to give you some educated guesses because we know a lot more about what she's not doing than we do about what she actually is doing. They've been pretty careful about not sprinkling in as many details as we all want, right? But we know that she's not like off at a resort, outside of Las Vegas in debate camp. We know that she's trying to avoid President Obama's kind of ritual and some of his mistakes from 2012. And we know that the way she's traditionally done debate prep is to go through kind of everything. She knows what her own policies are, but to review her own work, to review what her opponent has said and done in the past, and to try to be prepared not only to defend her own positions or explain her own positions, but to be able to check him and cross him if either he says something that she knows is not true, or if the debate moderator himself fails to go in that direction. So I expect that's a lot of what she's doing, but I'd love to tell you, like, is she in some room in her house watching videos, or, does she, she do it in the kitchen, or is there a tent set up in the backyard? We don't know a lot of those sort of details. The campaign is holding that really tight.
Dan, you made a comment when you were answering Mark's question about you said something you didn't want to go quite so far as to say that Donald Trump was handling his prep in a relaxed fashion. On the basis of everything that we know, it seems like he's handling it in a pretty relaxed fashion. So what do you think the dangers and the strengths are of going about debate prep the way that Trump seems to be, which is in a much more not nearly as rigorous, let's say, or structured a way as we know that Hillary Clinton generally does?
Well, let's start with the positive. He is very good in live TV settings, or very often is, and he demonstrated that in a lot of the Republican debates. He's comfortable in that environment. He knows how to make a quip. He knows how to try to put somebody off balance, and he enjoys doing that. So, in that sense, in the performance sense, he comes to it with a kind of a naturalness that she might not. I mean, he's spent many years in reality TV, and he likes and enjoys that environment. The challenge, I think, obviously, or the risk, is that this is 90 minutes. There's no break. It can be very substantive, depending on how the flow of the debate goes. He will have to produce deeper or more complex answers about some of his policies, or more consistent or coherent statements about his policies. He will have a greater difficulty kind of skating across the top of some of those issues than he might have been able to do in a debate with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people that he was able to do in the Republican debate. So I think that's the bigger risk for him.
Okay, Dan Balls and Margaret Talev, we're going to talk more about what's up in the presidential race, including more about the new Wall Street Journal NBC News poll. We'll continue our conversation with Dan Balls and Margaret Talev right after this quick break.
If I am the spoiler in this race, yippee, yippee. This is something that needs spoiling in a really big way. 50% of Americans right now, when they go to register to vote, are registering as independent. Where is that representation? It's not from Clinton. It's not from Trump. It's from me. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That was a highly animated Libertarian presidential candidate, Gary Johnson, today at a Bloomberg Politics breakfast in our nation's capital, hosted by yours truly. Now we're back with Bloomberg senior White House correspondent Margaret Talev and the Washington Post chief correspondent Dan Balls. Margaret, you just pointed out to me the fact that Donald Trump, in an interview that's going to be aired tonight with Sean Hannity, we've got a little bit of a transcript where he apparently is calling for stop and frisk to try to deal with, particularly in African-American communities. Just talk about what you think the political calculation there is and what kind of waves it's going to make to hear Donald Trump, especially in the wake of what's happened over the last couple of days, that Donald Trump is turning to stop and frisk.
Well, absolutely. We were talking about what to expect Monday night with this debate and kind of what Clinton's approach may be and what Trump's vulnerabilities may be. And this is sort of exactly in that wheelhouse where you have him speaking with black voters at churches, talking about, excessive police violence, how this is a problem, maybe some people shouldn't be police officers, very sympathetic tone, not making the stop and frisk speech before that audience of black voters. Right. So this is obviously a different audience on Hannity, but it's all on video and it will all be brought up at the debate. How does he sort of square that? How does he respond to that under questioning?
Dan, Mark and I talked a little bit earlier about the way Trump spoke today about the Tulsa shooting. He has obviously, prior to this, largely tried to cast himself as the law and order candidate, and been very highly supportive of law enforcement not in a blanket way, but highly supportive, and now we've got this stop and frisk piece of news. How do you think that Trump has handled so far a long stretch of time where these kinds of issues, racially charged issues that go to the core of questions about criminal justice in big cities in America, how do you think Trump has handled them politically?
Well, I guess what I would say is that I think his broad position is quite clear, and it was made clear at the Republican convention when he did his acceptance speech. He was the law and order candidate, and I think that's the broad message he wants to send out. There are moments, as there was today, when he tempers that and suggests somewhat, a somewhat softening of that very hard-edged law and order view. But I think when push comes to shove, he is and wants to be the law and order candidate.
Margaret, a Democrat who supports Hillary Clinton said to me today thought things were going pretty well. The most recent wave of polling, including this new NBC Wall Street Journal poll, better news for Clinton than last week's polling in the wake of the problems she had over the weekend. But they also said, you know what, it could be that this is such an overwhelming change election that there's nothing we can do. We can run a perfect race and Donald Trump could overwhelm us. Do you get the sense that that's a prevailing view within Democratic circles, that this may just be a Trump year and there's nothing Clinton can do?
No. I think that Clinton and her campaign are really dedicated to the proposition that the ground game, the infrastructure, the planning, all that sort of stuff actually does make a difference, particularly in places like Florida, Pennsylvania. Ohio, maybe that scenario applies. It's not entirely clear yet. But look, you've seen the polling get a little bit better since the initial, total fallout of Pneumonia Gate, which was a really dumb move on their part. And to the extent that she's beginning to put a little space between her and Donald Trump now, and these are polls, tend to be polls of likely voters. So if their presumption is that they can actually push that a little bit further because they're doing work to turn out people who those polls are not building into in sort of the prediction models of, then they can feel a little better than they could a week ago. I don't think that they're ceding that this is a runaway year that they can't do anything about. I think they do firmly believe that all that stuff that they're doing, the manpower on the ground, the kind of traditional campaign stuff, makes a difference. How much of a difference, obviously, we don't know yet.
Dan, a lot of analysts and a lot of people in the Clinton camp say, well, states where Trump's doing well, like Iowa and Ohio, they just say, well, there's a lot of white voters there. In the states where he's doing well, the battleground states where he's doing better, like Ohio, like Florida, where I am, what else is going on? What else is helping Trump besides just states with a lot of white voters?
Well, Florida, as you know, Mark, is always close and is going to be close. I mean, it's just been a battleground over the last several elections, and I don't think anybody in either campaign thought that one candidate or the other was going to get a big advantage in Florida. I mean, that was the closest, as I recall, in 2012, and very well may be the closest this time around. So I think the fact that he's doing well there is fine and to be expected. In some of the other states, I think it is a function of the percentage of the electorate, the white electorate, that has college degrees or doesn't have college degrees. The lower that percentage, the better Trump does. The higher the percentage, the more challenged he is. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of these battleground states.
Dan, you're the dean, so I'm going to close with you to ask this question. In this NBC Wall Street Journal poll, it says that people are asked various things, what concerns them most about Donald Trump. At the very top of the list is him not having the right temperament to be commander-in-chief. A little bit further down the list is his language and comments about women, immigrants, and Muslims. At the very bottom of the list, only 6% of people saying it's the thing that concerns them most is his failure to release his tax returns. Looking at that poll, can we deduce that there is no way we're going to see Donald Trump's tax returns before Election Day?
John, I think even if that number had been twice or three times that 6%, I don't think we would see the tax returns. I think he's made a decision that those tax returns are going to stay hidden as long as possible and well after the November 8th voting. So I think it is interesting and reflective that that the things that we talk about a lot are not that important to a lot of people. He is breaking precedent by not releasing them. There's no question about that. But it's not necessarily going to be a voting issue, and I think he's concluded that more harm could come from releasing them than not.
Margaret, is there anything we can do about this? Those of us who think it's really important for Donald Trump to release his tax returns?
I think he's decided that there's more downside in releasing them than there ever could be in making them public.
All right. Margaret Talib, Dan Balls, those are two very depressing answers on a topic that I think is quite important. Thank you both. Coming back, we'll do some consulting with the consultants right after this.
Welcome back. Joining us from Gotham City, Republican media consultant and strategist Patrick Griffin, who is currently an undecided voter regarding Donald Trump, his party's candidate. In Washington, D.C., Ben LaBolt, a Democratic strategist, former campaign press secretary for President Obama, and a big supporter of Hillary Clinton. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Ben LaBolt, if Hillary Clinton asked you for one piece of advice going into the debate, what would you tell her?
Well, I would tell her that she needs to hold Donald Trump accountable in the same way that she's being held accountable in this election. People are still treating Donald Trump like a celebrity host who a different standard applies to during this campaign. She should make clear that if the moderator doesn't ask him questions that are just as tough on foreign policy and domestic policy, that she raises those questions directly to him.
Pat Griffin, if Donald Trump called you and said, Pat, what am I doing well that I should bring to the debate, what would you tell him?
I would tell him to decide which Donald Trump is going to show up, Mark. Is it Dr. Jekyll or is it Mr. Hyde? What kind of performance does he want to make that night? Hillary Clinton shows up usually acting like Tracy Flick from my favorite movie, Election. She can spell every nation in Africa backwards, but she's not good at connecting. I think one of the reasons Donald Trump is still in this thing is it's a change election, and he has to consistently remind people he is the candidate of change, something she can never, ever be.
So, Pat, let me ask you to flip this question around and ask you what you think the one thing or the most important thing is that Donald Trump needs to avoid doing. What would be the biggest mistake he could make in the debate on Monday?
You know, I think the problem is, John, that Donald Trump is going to be whichever Donald Trump he's comfortable being. We've seen him in debates before. We've seen this guy perform. He kind of likes this. I think if this thing devolves into a food fight between both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, it's a lot like that traffic wreck on the highway. People are going to stop and see the wreck. Nobody hangs around much to watch it get cleaned up. The problem for Trump is to convince people he is presidential, but at the same time, he is a candidate that will change things in Washington. That's fundamentally one of the reasons Hillary Clinton can't get off the runway here. She's a terrible candidate, exactly the wrong time, and she's doing way too much sort of policy wonking than she is connecting. Trump's got to connect, and he's got to convince people he's prepared for the big chair at the big desk.
Ben, I ask you the same question. If you were working with Hillary Clinton, I know you're not, what would you counsel her to avoid in the course of Monday? What's the biggest mistake she could make or the biggest trap she could be lured into?
Well, having worked in the last presidential, I think where Mitt Romney lost the second two debates was in that he talked to the moderator instead of the audience back home. And by litigating rules and follow-ups with the moderator, instead of looking directly at the camera and telling to the American people what she's going to do to get the economy moving again for average people, that would be an enormous mistake.
All right. Do you think she has a risk if she gets drawn into a too personal confrontation with him? The kind of, the getting down in the mud with the pig and, you get dirty and the pig likes it?
Well, I think Donald Trump is not a typical candidate. She's not going to play on his level. He's made clear that he's willing to get personal, not only about her, but about the moderator. Yeah. And that's certainly unconventional. But that's where I think she has to turn to the audience back home, outline her vision for the country, and also use Donald Trump's words against him.
Right.
Pat, the Republican Senate candidates, including Kelly Ayotte in your state of New Hampshire, are all doing pretty well in most of the battleground Senate contests. Why do you think that is, and what's your prognosis on whether Republicans will keep the majority?
Quickly, let me just say this, Mark. I don't think we have to worry about Donald Trump acting like Mitt Romney in terms of rules. I don't think I'd worry much about that. With regard to the Senate seats, as Trump has made this a little closer in a couple of states, the environment, the meteorological sort of ring around this race has gotten better for Senate Republicans. If we look at guys like Rob Portman, he's done a very good job early on pushing himself away from this Trump meteorological force at the top of the ticket. But in all of these other places, as the large sort of environment gets better, these Republican Senate candidates have been able to sort of find a way to wedge themselves away from Trump and also make the generic sort of turnout for these elections look better for Republicans. So I think that in many of these cases, the better the top of the ticket does, the better it does down ticket, and these races are tightening up. There's more and more money coming in. Republican Senate candidates are raising more than ever before. I think these races suddenly look way more competitive in places we didn't think they would be just a few weeks ago.
Ben, rattle off the states you think your party's going to win to take back the majority.
Well, I would start with Illinois. That's at the top. I then go to Wisconsin. We're in a very strong position in Pennsylvania. I do think we'll win New Hampshire. The poll there had Ayotte down 2 today. Florida's really tight. Some of these races are coming onto the map that we didn't even anticipate. The fact is Mitch McConnell rushed to endorse Donald Trump. You know what you're going to get with these Senate candidates if you reelect Republicans to the Senate.
So your list got you pretty close to the majority, but not all the way there. Sounds like you're saying it's not a sure thing Democrats are going to take the Senate back.
Well, I would never say that. I mean, I've been in some really tight races. We thought we were going to win that came down to the wire. It all comes down to turnout. It really comes down to the turnout of the Obama coalition. If you voted for the president the last 2 times, if you believe that we need to continue on our progress of providing health care access to people, of getting the economy moving for working people again, you saw wages go up in a big way for the first time in a long time. This is an election you need to vote to. And again, I don't think Democrats should get complacent.
Pat, let me ask you the question, the kind of question we've been asking for months and months, which is about kind of how Republicans are feeling about Donald Trump. It seems like part of the reason why he closed the gap with Hillary Clinton a bit in the polling is that Republicans have come home. How solid is that Trump now has kind of reassured most of the members of his party? Is it solid, or are they still a flight risk?
Well, there are still some folks out there, I think, that have reservations about Trump, John. But the key to this thing is Trump has an opportunity on Monday night to convince people in this country that he is capable of being president. It's not just attacking Hillary Clinton. We know Donald Trump can do that because we saw him do that to 17 other Republicans. I think his challenge is to remind people again and again and again that Hillary Clinton is the poster child for everything wrong with Washington. She has, after all, been there almost as long as the Washington Monument. So that helps Trump. I think one of the other problems Hillary has is trying to convince people that she can be something other than a creature of Washington. That's the dynamic in this race right now, and I think Trump's big opportunity here, and I say big opportunity, is to behave himself, no checking, and to try to make not every single point. Hillary Clinton is a better debater. She has won this thing already in terms of expectations. Trump needs to show up, be substantive enough, and make sure that he makes the case for change or more of the same. That's what's on the ballot.
Okay, Pat, not quite almost as long as the Washington Monument. That's not quite accurate. Ben, real quick, other than the fact that Hillary Clinton is not Barack Obama, why is she having so much trouble getting enthusiasm out of the Obama coalition that you mentioned before?
Well, I think for a lot of people, like young voters, they tune in late. They tune in post-Labor Day. They're back in school. They're looking at the race. They need to be motivated. You've seen people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, others who are fighting for the same issues that Hillary are for, go out and get younger voters excited. People are familiar with her. She's been in public life for a long time. But now the audience is tuning into the debates and the choice. And I think if she can convince people not only of her qualifications, but the fact that Donald Trump is unsteady and dangerous and would upset world order with that audience, not only will she win the debate, she'll win the election.
Okay, Ben LeBold, Pat Griffin, thank you both. Coming up, we're going to check in on some new polling data regarding high-income voters. Our latest Bloomberg Politics Purple Slice poll right after this.
This morning, Bloomberg Politics and Purple Strategies released our latest Slice poll. This one was focused on likely voters with an annual household income of $100,000 or more. The poll found that in a four-way race, Hillary Clinton leads with 41% of the vote, while Donald Trump carries 37%. Compare these numbers to Mitt Romney's performance in 2012, where he won this group of rich people, 54% to Obama's 44%. We're joined now by the managing director of Purple Strategies to talk about what we found. But Doug, here's the first question I have for you. Why do we care about how rich people are going to vote?
It's a great question. I think that what's most important is looking at the different divides in the electorate. And when you compare what we found here, which shows Clinton in very good shape compared to Romney, you compare that to what went on in our poll of less educated voters, you see a huge schism in the electorate, big divides. And the real question is, can Trump put together those groups, the coalitions of those who support him by strong measures, and win the election?
Right. It is a strange thing, right? I mean, the basic deal here is that rich people normally vote for Republicans, and in this case, Hillary Clinton seems to have the advantage. Just talk a little bit more about that previous poll and the schism, because it seems to me like maybe in addition to education, it's one of the biggest schisms that the new kind of schism that this election is producing?
Absolutely. There's been a divide in the electorate during this election that we've seen for months now. Back in June, Pew compared some of the results and found that the difference between white college-educated women and white downscale men was dramatic, and it's something that's growing. And if you take a look at our polling, you see the same thing. You have wealthy, well-educated voters, generally well-educated, that is, supporting her by 4 points. You have white downscale voters, less educated voters, supporting him by 22 points. And the thing is that this type of divide goes deep. It goes way beyond just the vote. On some of the things that campaigns like to measure. For example, take a look at cares about people like me. Right. Among the wealthier voters, you have Clinton with an 11-point advantage, right? Among downscale, white, less educated voters, you have Trump plus 16. Another thing that's of critical importance in campaigns, we'll fight for the middle class. Right. You have high-income voters believing Clinton would do a job by 9 points. Trump by 18 points among white, less educated voters. It goes on to shares my values, and goes on to is ready to lead the country on day one. It's almost like there's two Americas, two groups of voters, as John Edwards might have said, but it's unbelievable that they look at the candidates in such incredibly different ways.
Doug, an interesting question we asked that produced an interesting result. Amongst these wealthy people, we asked who would be better, which candidate would be better for your investments? What was the result, and were you surprised by it as I was?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. What we saw was it's one of the places where Trump holds a pretty substantial advantage, a 9-point advantage, 45 to 36. They said that Trump would do better for their investments. But then we took a look at those people that thought one of the candidates or the other would do a better job for their investments. And for those who said Trump would do a better job on their investments, basically those that agreed that Trump would make them richer, he still doesn't carry 17% of those. You have 17% of voters who said they would rather lose money than vote for Trump. And that includes 7% that are currently voting for Clinton and 10% that are undecided at this point. So it's really quite something to see such a divide, even among wealthier Americans.
Doug, beyond our poll, take 20 seconds because you watch all the polls closely. How would you handicap the race currently, nationally?
Right now, I'd say that Clinton actually has a little bit of momentum. While we are in the field over the 4 days, we usually don't like to go through this in detail, but we definitely saw some movement towards Clinton. And if you take a look at the national polling right now, it does appear that there was a dip during the week of her health problems, where she had undoubtedly a bad week. But if you take a look right now, it's moving back to where I think is the normal place of the race right now, about a 4 to 5 point advantage nationally for Clinton. Other states will carry along as you see that, which again brings up the importance of these debates. It's really the time when, if you look historically at elections, when if there's going to be any movement after the conventions, it happens then.
All right, Doug Usher, thank you so much. As always, it's great being your partner. Up next, we have a really exciting announcement. But if you happen to be watching us here in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM, and we'll be right back with that announcement.
John, I won't say I definitely found the best piece of Trump paraphernalia in the whole campaign, but I might have. Look at these beautiful socks, which will soon be adorning our set in New York.
Oh!
Spectacular. Spectacular. All right, so the first presidential debate, as you all know, is Monday. Fear not, Bloomberg Politics is going to have special pre- and post-game coverage. We're going to start with a preview half hour at 8:30 Eastern that night. Wrap things up with debate analysis right here on this channel and exclusively on Twitter. Look forward to that. John and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.